This week on Inside Olympia, how will President Trump's tariffs affect Washington businesses, farmers, and consumers? How will Washington create the energy it needs for the future? And what opportunities and challenges does artificial intelligence present for our state? On the program to discuss those issues and much more, Director of Commerce, Nguyen.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. Washington is often described as one of the most trade-dependent states in the country. So what impact will President Trump's tariffs have on our economy? And how else could Trump's policies affect Washington commerce and business? Also, as the state moves away from fossil fuels, where will we get the energy we need to power an energy-hungry future? And how can Washington grow the businesses of the future, harness AI, and promote innovation? Joining me now and for the full hour this week for his first interview on Inside Olympia in his new role, former state senator and now director of the State Department of Commerce, Nguyen. Welcome back to the program. Welcome in your new capacity to the program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Nice to see you. What's the transition from state senator to agency director been like?
A lot more HR than I thought. No,
you got to manage a bunch of people.
It's been great, actually. So I'm in a very unique position where I get to implement the policies that a number of us worked on in the legislature over the past 6 years and see it come to fruition. One of the first events that I went to was with a covenant homeownership program that Commerce helps administer. I worked on that in the legislature with John Lovick on our side when it came over to the Senate. And to see families benefiting from it was inspiring. I mean, I got a little bit emotional as well. So it's really cool to go from the legislature where you fight over these ideas to now you're implementing the ideas, and it's much more gratifying, I will say.
The Department of Commerce, I don't mean this in a negative way, but it can be sort of viewed as like a grab bag agency.
Yeah,
it's got
it
a
is.
lot going on.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about it or describing it? It's a pass-through agency for a lot of funding.
Yeah. So Commerce has about 485 programs, and it's about $8 billion that we manage. So if this was a publicly traded company, you're talking about a Fortune 500 company. There are no other jurisdictions bigger than this beyond, say, for instance, other agencies or maybe the city of Seattle. So it is a behemoth in terms of the reach that we have, and everything from behavioral health, housing, community safety, gun violence, all kinds of things. So
Not to mention economic development, which is sort of what people might think about with the Department of Commerce.
Yeah, so economic development, all those things. So, oftentimes people come to government when things aren't going well. Well, our hope is to make sure that people are having their best day when they work with us, whether it's a grant, whether it's EV charging. I really see us as the Oprah of state agencies, where we really are out
Did you
there
say
to
the
help.
Oprah?
The Oprah, yeah.
Oh.
You get a grant, you get an EV charger,
okay.
you get support for your project, you get housing, right? So that's the ways that we can fit in to support our communities across Washington State.
And just remind us of your background before you were a state senator and sort of what set you up and prepared you for this role.
Yeah, so my background largely was in the tech sector. I actually ran strategy and operations for a number of larger firms, but also some startups as well. So what's fascinating, this is the third iteration of the times where I've had to do change management. Not at this scale by any means, but having that context and that background certainly has been helpful as I kind of moved into this role.
And just before we launch into some of these big issues, including, and we're going to begin with tariffs in a moment, what are you noticing? There's a new book out by Ezra Klein of the New York Times and Derek Thompson of The Atlantic called Abundance. The theory being that especially the left, liberals, Democrats, should be thinking much more about what's possible in terms of building, especially an example would be a housing shortage, which your agency is dealing with. Interestingly, there's also sort of an abundance theory on the right, which is kind of a deregulation-based focus. If you reduce regulations, you will allow for the growth we need to have in the economy. But both sides seem to be talking about this concept of abundance, and it's also in the context of what Thompson and Klein are writing about, and I think you've read the book, is the idea that Democrats and Democratic policies are sometimes getting in the way of solving these big deal problems like housing.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about how you're thinking about the bureaucracy.
So he's been writing about that for a while, and I completely agree. I think that's one of the first things that I noticed, not just in commerce, but coming into legislature as a whole, is that we've become so focused, we being on the Democratic Party, we are so focused on process that we forget the outcomes that we want, right? We say we want to build clean energy, but we take years to site transmission lines. We want to build housing, but it takes years for us to permit. We want to make sure that we electrify everything as well, but we take years to get that infrastructure set up. And just to give you an example of how that plays out in Washington State specifically. So me as Commerce, most of my job actually is grant making and then writing the reimbursements as well, right? So people come to us, they have a great project, we fund them, they get reimbursed. The state administrative and accounting manual that we have to adhere to, that grantees have to adhere to in order to get reimbursed is 1,067 pages. If you have federal dollars that we're passing through, that's another 200-ish pages as well. You have the DES contract standards.
That's Department of Enterprise Services.
Yep, Department of Enterprise Services. Sorry, I'll stop using acronyms. That's another few hundred pages, right? Plus program guidelines, plus budget provisos. So just to administer one program, you're talking 1,500 pages minimum that you have to review, have to understand, and have to comply with. To give you an example, that's longer than Game of Thrones, right? That's the whole volumes of Lord of the Rings. That's double the longest Harry Potter book. So if you can imagine a commerce where our job is to help people, and the only way that you can start is if you have access to basically a government affairs person, a grant writer, a compliance person, somebody to review your invoices, a CPA audit. You're talking if you're able to even get access to a grant, maybe it's $1 million. There's at least $300,000 to $400,000 of compliance costs associated with that. So this is part of.
I'll just jump in and say Jennifer Polka has written about this. She used to be in the Obama administration.
I just texted her this morning. She's a friend of mine. Yeah.
And so she talks about policy craft, and she talks about these thousands of pages. Sometimes state employees they're still new after 10 years because they are still learning the rules.
They're still learning.
So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but what are you thinking about the governor, the new governor, Ferguson, has said he's not here to defend government, he's here to reform government. What opportunities do you see to try to cut through some of this bureaucracy?
I think it's actually very easy, to be honest with you. A lot of it is that the reasons why these layer on top of each other is nobody has the guts to say, maybe we shouldn't do that. We've essentially built a system where you're trying to catch that fraction of a percent, the 1% that might cause a problem, and you punish everybody else.
Right, because you're trying to make sure there's not waste, fraud, abuse.
That's right. But the reason why you do that is because the infrastructure is not set up. At least in commerce, and I'm going to suspect other places, you don't actually have the tools to be successful. So about 30 minutes ago, I was demoing a tool with my team that I built over the weekend. I was just testing it out, publicly available data. So I took the state accounting manual, I took the federal guidelines, and I took program guidelines that you can find online, so nothing that's private, and I made a custom GPT. So OpenAI, I created a wrapper around it, and then I was asking it questions of what is or is not compliant. And then I took sample invoices of things that potentially could be invoices, and I said, rank this high, medium, and low. And it came back, and it was fairly accurate. That is good, XYZ, this is bad, ABC. There are ways for us to be much more effective so that we can still be compliant, provide the tools for our staff to be much more effective with their time, and our resources structured in a way where we're focusing on the partnerships.
And you're making a case for using AI to help do this work.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about AI a little bit more in a few minutes. Let me just ask you to compare and contrast what you're describing with what is happening at the federal level with the Elon Musk-led Department of Government Efficiency, which obviously Democrats have pushed back very hard on.
Well, what's interesting is that I think our values are fundamentally different, right? They're using a smokescreen where they're calling it Department of Government Efficiencies, and they're saying that they're doing this for efficiencies. Well, it's not. It's not empathetic. It's not kind. You're seeing the ramifications happen across the United States. You're seeing kind of disruption that happens for no reason. So what they're doing, I think, is veiled under efficiency. It's more, privatizing public sector jobs and stuff like that to benefit themselves. So what we're doing is, how do we actually unlock and enable the things that we all agree on are right? So what I'm trying to do is be a model for the anti-Elon Musk, the anti-Doge, of if you really want efficiency, I think this is how you do it with empathy and care. This is how you do it with state workers, and this is how you do it with a team of people who are really dedicated to that craft and not just cut and slash things for no reason.
You have worked in the corporate sector, though, and I can imagine, I don't know that I've heard Elon Musk say this directly, but there is a kind of ethos in Silicon Valley of move fast and break things. I think Mark Zuckerberg coined that term.
Yeah.
Is there an element of that is appropriate to
Yeah.
bring to state government? Do you
Yes, I think the answer is 100% yes. Because the opposite happens too, is that you don't move fast and you do nothing. That's really what happens oftentimes here in the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
What I found in the last 6 or 7 years, whenever there's a tough problem that was to be had, I saw two things happen most of the times. One is nothing. Usually nothing happens. The other is you ban it, right? So I'm trying to find that middle path where, look, these are good things. And part of it is how you message it. Part of it is how you do change management. Part of it is how you show the impact on people's lives. Because it is scary, right? It can be scary to do something new and different and difficult. So what we're trying to do is show value. We have demos. That's also a Jennifer Polka thing. It's demos over memos. And then showing how it fits into their life and their work and the value that it brings. Not necessarily trying to replace anybody, just trying to augment what they're doing.
I should have made a note of this when you said it, but the director of the Department of Commerce weekend project was building, in essence, a homebrew ChatGPT to see if he can make his agency more.
I made two of them.
That might be a first. That might be a first.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't know if any other agency directors can do that.
That's okay. So let me just provide some fast facts about this agency and about Washington State in terms of commerce. First off, we're often described, or I've historically heard us described as the most trade-dependent state in the country. Apparently, we're ranked ninth among trading states, but we're certainly one of the most trade-dependent states in the country. Our total state exports in 2024 were $58 billion. The value of exports and imports moving through our ports, around $120 billion. And the number or the percentage of state jobs tied to exports, 40%. I also want to transition into talking about the federal level tariffs and what their impacts might be. We have a graphic that addresses some of the potential impacts here in Washington State. On the aerospace front, these tariffs could potentially add $40 million to the price of a Boeing 787. The tech industry faces the risk of retaliation from countries like China, as well as loss of market access. Clean energy, 90,000 jobs in our state rely on critical minerals that are controlled by China. Of course, there's the potential for retail prices to go up. Amazon, Nordstrom, Costco. Small businesses could be hit. We've got 12,000 state exporters who could be hurt by higher costs. And then, of course, agriculture. $7.5 billion in exports face tariffs. 90% of our wheat is exported. Your agency has just launched a tariff information and resource guide. These tariffs are on again, off again. They change by the day. What will be included changes, and then the retaliatory tariffs change by the day. How are you approaching this?
Well, you know what's interesting is that we used to be even higher on the trade exposed states, but this is not our first rodeo. During the first Trump administration, similar tariffs were imposed, and we have not recovered from them. We're still down 30% of exports to the Asia-Pacific region because of the previous ones. So we haven't recovered from the last time this happened. We're in a worse spot, and now this is happening again. So part of what we're trying to do is help people understand what options are available to them. That's why that tool is now available. We also have resources across Washington State. So for instance, there's a small business resiliency network that we operate. A number of our entities that we partner with go through that itself as well. But I will just say is that there is no way in Washington State that we can cover the gap for a global tariff trade war. That is just not possible. So one of the best things that we can do is work with our partners. I've met with Canada, Mexico, Vietnam, representatives from China, just to reassure them that even though the federal level is behaving the way that they are, the state plans to be and will continue to be a partner with them as well. So we're trying to weather the storm as best as we can. And look, these trade policies are, to me, not thoughtful, right? I think their idea is that by doing this, you'll get all these jobs back, you'll get all these manufacturing back.
You'll force manufacturing back stateside.
And if that happens, this would be a fantastic and brilliant plan. But up until that happens, this is an abject failure. And it's failing right now, right? The market uncertainty has certainly impacts our portfolios. It certainly impacts jobs and livelihoods, and it's going to impact our exports from farmers in Washington State.
I know the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, has suggested, he's got a giant economy, fifth largest in the world, just direct negotiations with these countries. Have you been in touch with your California counterpart? Is there any talk of sort of a West Coast approach? What have these these conversations you've had with representatives from these trading countries net? Is there any?
That is an option. So the moment I saw that, I messaged some friends down there that I used to serve with in the legislature that are counterparts there in the California legislature. Yeah. So there are conversations being had. Nothing is official just yet. This is more of just early on. Because candidly, we actually don't know what the impacts are, right? It changes every single day. Certain industries are included, certain industries are not. But I think having that as a potential is an option for us.
So I mentioned that the Tariff Information and Resources Guide launched recently, last Friday, from your agency. You also acknowledge there's not a lot, this is a potential global trade war, not a lot one state agency can do.
Yeah.
But what is your advice to companies? What is your advice to consumers?
Yeah.
What are some ways you think that the state might be able to help mitigate for some of the impacts?
Well, so first off, we have a great team. Our Office of Economic Development team is phenomenal, and they deployed this pretty quickly, which is fantastic. I think the other one is we are seeing the federal administration bend and flex a little bit. They have very strong postures. They get pushed back, and they change some of their policies. Your stories are very important. The impacts to communities are very important. We see that actually does influence some of the decisions. So as you're being impacted by some of these policies, share your stories. We work with our federal delegation. I was with Patty Murray the other day, and we had this conversation as well. So making sure that you share your stories with our federal delegation is going to be important. Know that the Department of Commerce is here to help kind of guide through that process as well, even with one-on-one consulting. We do have some funds to help mitigate some of the risks depending on what industry that it happens to be in. But at the very least, it's going to be a wait and see because I can't control what they do in the White House.
What is your biggest concern? I mean, we already have a state budget problem.
Yeah.
Revenues, got to be careful here. They're not growing as fast as they have historically. They're actually still growing at sort of historic norms.
Yeah.
But the state legislature is dealing with a budget gap, and our economy is, potentially fragile.
Yeah.
What are the sort of, what might keep you awake at night, or what are your worries when you think about how much we depend on international trade for instance, on the ag side of
Yeah.
things?
Well, I really worry that our most vulnerable communities are the ones that are most likely to be hardest hit. And you have Point Roberts communities that are literally siloed off. They're dependent
This is
upon.
that community that is not attached to the mainland. It's
That's
right
right.
on the
Yeah.
edge of Canada there.
Yeah.
Little speck of Washington.
Little
up
speck
there
of
in
Washington up there
in the
where
strait,
their
yeah.
grocery store might not be able to survive. You see hotel stays in towns from Bellingham, Seattle, even down south. You see small businesses where they get goods from China, and from when they purchase their goods and they're on a boat heading to the United States, to Washington, to Seattle specifically, a tariff happens. They can't necessarily just pay 100% more. So this is going to have devastating impacts across our communities, which is only going to exacerbate the budget problems that we have as well. So for me, it's how do we protect our communities as best as we can, weather this storm, move us forward? I don't think it's going to be easy.
And the last question I have about this is, you said if it works, great, because bringing more jobs and more manufacturing back to the States would be a good thing from your perspective.
Yeah.
What would you say about what an appropriate trade policy would be, what the White House could be doing to try to accomplish some of that, but maybe different than they're approaching it now?
We saw it in the Biden administration, the IIJA, the IRA, the CHIPS Act. If we're trying to target specific industries to come back to the United States, that was how we should do it.
I know a criticism, and I think it actually comes up in that abundance book, is too much red tape.
Too much red tape?
Too many rules, too many
Yeah.
things, make it hard for people to decide to bring their factory back.
Well, and also the rules conflict. So I'll just give you an example, right? We were, and this is kind of like the Washington version of abundance. We were given money to fund behavioral health facilities in Washington State. Commerce was.
Through the federal government,
Through the feds, but also through the state. So there's a state proviso, and it asked us to fund all kinds of behavioral health units, including youth behavioral health. One of the proviso languages, the requirement was you had to take law enforcement drop-off. Well, law enforcement drop-off doesn't really work for a youth behavioral health clinic. We did it anyways, and it got in trouble by the SAO, and I've met with them to talk about it. So there are conflicting rules that we have to play with. And again, the problem that I find is there's this concept that I call OPM, other people's money, right? Where there's this ethos where it's like, well, it's not my money, so I don't really care. Well, you should care because these are taxpayer dollars and we need to be respectful of them. So for me, we should spot those things, fix those things, deploy them in a strategic and smart way, and we need that across all of government.
SAO, by the way, state auditor.
State auditor, too many acronyms.
Took me a second to calculate.
Yeah.
Compute. Okay, let's transition to energy funding, climate change, clean energy. The previous gubernatorial administration had very ambitious plans about moving to a clean energy future, including all electric cars, all new cars sold in the state would be electric, I think, by 2030.
Yeah.
We've got the 40 or 45 transition to clean electricity.
Yeah, CETA,
I saw, a press release from your agency just a few days ago was pulling back on a tidal energy program offshore because of tribal objections.
Yeah.
We've seen community pushback to solar and wind projects east of the mountains.
Yeah.
I know you're just getting in there and figuring that, looking at this agency, but when you think about our energy needs, what it's going to take to build out and the pace we're on, the trajectory we're on, what's it looking like?
Tribal engagement and transmission lines. Those are the two ways that we do it. I met with a tribe this morning, and they had strong ambitions around that space as well. I actually think it's possible, right? In Washington State, we have enough sun, we have enough wind, and we have other resources potentially available to us, like hydroelectricity. So from a technical perspective, we are more than capable of building enough energy for our future, even with data centers. We can actually do it. The limitations that we have are not technical. They're bureaucracy, it's red tape, it's regulation, it's those things. So those things we impose on ourselves if we can choose to fix them, right? And part of it too is, so my previous role, as you know, was the chair of the Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee. In that capacity, I went around Washington State, met with most of the federally recognized tribes, along with stakeholders. And what I found is that they're inundated with these types of projects. And they're done in a way that is full of hubris and ego. And that causes a strain. So I actually do think that there's a way for us to build more energy in a respectful, mindful way, but we also have to prioritize what that looks like as well. So I feel like I'm in a unique position to kind of serve in that space.
You played a key role, if I remember correctly, in passage of the Climate Commitment Act as well, when you were in the legislature. So is there any thought that you have that the state of Washington needs to change its timeline, scale back its expectations, build more of a runway?
Well, yes and no, right? Like those timelines and goals were set from the Paris Agreement. So those are the goals set basically. Climate change is happening. It's not as if we can just say, hey, Mother Nature, can you stop if we just pause for a second? That doesn't exist. So those goals were set on purpose, and they were aggressive on purpose because we have to decarbonize as fast as possible. And the reason why Washington State set those goals is because we have always been a beacon when it comes to climate policies, even before Governor Inslee, but especially with Governor Inslee. So the thing for us is that if we can prove to the world that this is possible, other people will show up. The fact that the CCA was attacked and also defended at the ballot was a signal to everybody else. You're now seeing other jurisdictions think through what that looks like for them. So I think those goals are important. Yes, are they aggressive? Certainly. Have done this before? No. But that's what leadership looks like.
You did not mention nuclear. How do you see that fitting into the energy portfolio in the state?
So Energy Northwest is a phenomenal organization that we have here, and they're looking at small modular reactors, which are very different than the previous legacy ones. There was investment in the CCA to help kind of encourage what that might look like. We have a unique opportunities because nuclear inherently is very costly, and the development cycle takes a long time as well. Because of a small investment in the CCA, relatively small in the CCA, you now have companies like Amazon or Microsoft and otherwise, obviously they care about data centers, investing in these technologies that otherwise would not get enough public funding to be able to get through. We also have a unique opportunity for nuclear in Washington State because we have the old, they were called whoops sites. Yeah. They were nuclear facilities that never made it off the ground, but the transmission lines were built, and then most of the permitting was already done. So we actually have a very unique opportunity to do small modular reactors in Washington State in a way that is more mindful, ethical, and I think commiserate with kind of what the community wants as well. But there is a process.
So just to go back to your prescription for how to move things along more quickly, you talked about tribal engagement.
That's right.
And you talked about transmission lines. What opportunity do you see to speed up this car that's heading towards this clean energy future, and to sort of reduce the friction that these projects are encountering?
Well, I think relationships are key. right? And you have to come at it with humility and respect. I represented the 34th district, which is Seattle, and I spent a lot of times not in Seattle. I traveled throughout Washington State, all the way to Ponderay, Spokane, Yakima, Ellensburg, Quincy, all those places, because you wanted to talk through what made sense for them. A lot of times when there's opposition, it's because there's been a lack of engagement, a lack of conversation, a lack of trust. I've seen innovative projects that is being done by the Snohomish PUD. They're doing things that are being fought by other communities, and it's fine, and it's actually safe because they engaged early and they engage often. You have to have trust as the foundation. So that's why I spend so much time on the road, is building some of those conversations, and we're seeing them happen right now.
One last question about this energy need and how we're going to meet it in the future is with the energy needs of AI and new data centers coming online. How do we make sure that those data centers don't gobble up all of the new megawatts we're putting on the grid?
It's kind of this double-edged sword, right? Because technology drives our economy, but it also consumes a lot of our energy as well. The governor, in an executive order, has a task force to kind of figure out what that might look like in practice. I think at the end of the day, whether it is data centers, whether it is manufacturing, whether it's EVs, whether it's building decarbonization, we just need more clean energy. What's fascinating, I got cold called by OpenAI, so the company behind ChatGPT, and they put out an RFP saying they want basically a gig of energy, and Washington State was attractive to them. First off, it was interesting that a company like that would cold call the director of commerce, but I thought it was spam at first, and then I took it, and it was real. But people are watching us to see how we innovate. I actually do think that we have the ability to create enough energy, especially if you include SMRs. And if fusion works...
SMRs being the small
modular reactors. Yeah. And we also have a company called Helion in Washington State that's pioneering work in fusion. They already have contracts signed with Microsoft to deploy 50 megawatts of energy. That still requires transmission lines, by the way. Yeah. So I do think that we can build enough energy if we choose to do so. And the conversations that I'm having now with certain community members, the conversations that I'm having now with certain tribes is very different than it was before. And a lot of it is because we're showing our value because of the Climate Commitment Act and the investments we made in that space.
Okay, let me just, before we go to break, throw a wrinkle into this, and it goes back to the Trump administration's policies. You've warned that hundreds of millions of dollars in federal energy funding are now at risk.
Yep.
The president has issued a directive targeting state climate laws.
Yeah.
And he has signed an executive order that orders the Department of Justice to go after states that have laws that target climate change. So when you think about the policies of the Trump administration being aimed at the state of Washington's climate and climate policies and the potential for federal funding to go away, how damaging could that be? What are you having to prepare for?
Yeah, potentially. Thankfully, we're in a better spot than I think most jurisdictions because we have the Climate Commitment Act. And I'll just back up a little bit, too.
But he wants to go after the state because we have the Climate Commitment Act.
So Gavin Newsom had a phenomenal press release after that, and it was maybe 2 sentences, and it said, these executive orders are just glorified press releases. So
essentially the view is they're not going to be enforceable.
Well, executive orders pertain to federal agencies. You cannot supersede state laws by executive order. It needs an act of Congress. So that's one step. The other one is that the federal funds could and might be at risk. That is certainly a thing. So for items that have already been earmarked, obligated, they should go because they're subject to the Impoundment Act, right? So they have to move forward. But new funding certainly would have been better under an administration that was more thoughtful about climate change. But my point being is that this actually isn't just about climate change. It's about energy independence. It's about resiliency. It's about sovereignty. I'll listen to a podcast with members of the cabinet in the federal administration, and they're very clear that they want to build more energy, all kinds of energy. Obviously, they're not as passionate about some of the renewable stuff, but they certainly still care. So I think that there is an avenue for us to play in that space.
The president's very pro-coal.
Yeah, which is not economically going to be a thing, but yes, he is.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, we continue our interview with the Director of the State Department of Commerce, Nguyen. Back right after this.
There's been losses every year since the early 1920s. The shoreline itself was almost 2 miles further out there. Year after year, more homes would fall in the water. We have nothing to lose.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Commerce Director Joe Nguyen. And I want to transition to another huge portfolio for the Department of Housing and a huge issue in this state. We talked about energy and building for the future. Yeah. Housing is also in short supply, and we don't have what we need for the future. Your own agency, I think, has estimated we'll need a million or 1.1 million units by 2040. If I remember correctly, half or more are going to have to be available to the lowest income Washingtonians. Yeah. We also need 75,000 temporary shelter beds. We've clearly homelessness is a huge issue in this state, and we've dug ourselves a giant hole. So how do we get out of this? I know the Housing Trust Fund, which is also under the auspices of Commerce, is getting a record, I think, infusion of money from the capital construction budget.
Assume it gets signed.
Yes, so 600 million, which is 200 million more than more than the high water mark previously.
Yeah, exactly. So
and that's the fund that helps build affordable.
Yeah, 100%, 80%, under 80% AMI. And first off, the Housing Trust Fund was a legacy of Frank Chop and his leadership in that space. There's
former Speaker of the House who just passed away.
Yeah.
And in fact, your agency put out a memorial. A memoriam to him.
Well, and just to deviate, I mean, I called him, I think 3 days before he passed away, and I was asking him a question about housing development. And you can hear water running in the background, and it was 8 o'clock in the morning. I call people when I drive to Olympia. Mm-hmm. He's like, "Hey, Joe, how's it going?" I'm like, "Hey, I had a couple of questions on these things." He's like, "I'm in the shower. Can I call you back?" I'm like, "Of course, Frank. Of course." But that's how much he cared.
That sounds like him, yes.
That's how much he cared.
He answers the phone while he's in the shower.
Yeah.
And he's thought of as the father of the Housing Trust Fund.
He is, yeah. And so the Housing Trust Fund historically has had about $2 billion of investments in it, most of it coming in the last 6 years. And $600 million, should the proposals pass, would be another historic amount. So just setting that context, I actually gave a presentation to the House Capital Budget Committee, and I gave a presentation to the Senate Ways and Means Committee on this topic as well. So mind you, historic investments in the Housing Trust Fund, as much as we've ever seen in the history of Washington State. If you look at the number of housing units that bought, the number of housing units that we helped enable, it accounts to about 2% of what we actually need on an annual basis, right? So we can do as much as we can at the state to enable, in this case, affordable housing, so under 80% AMI, and that definition shifts as well. But we need the capital markets. We need other investments. So in that report, the HB 2020 report that you're referring to, the baseline started in 2020, and during the pandemic, interest rates were very low. Capital was very high because of the infusion from the feds. So we over-delivered in terms of the number of units that were built. We built way more than we had expected. But permit numbers are going down. The interest rate markets, the way that they are going down. The uncertainty because of things like the Trump tariffs, raising costs for housing, we're seeing all these things going back down. So we have both a headwind and a tailwind in the sense that we're getting more money for support of the most affordable housing, but we also need the capital markets to come in as well.
I want to get to one of the tension points, which is that Democrats in this state have, because of climate policies and environmental policies, added requirements to new construction that do raise the cost.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we're trying to build more units. And one of the criticisms is often that, so the private sector says, look, you're just adding costs onto what's already not an affordable marketplace.
Yeah.
And then on the Housing Trust Fund side, going back to that book we've been talking about, they point out all these examples of where efforts to build public housing, publicly financed housing, it ends up being, $500,000 per unit because
or more
because of all of the state and local regulations. So you're a Democrat, you've been in the legislature, you're also now running an agency that's got this mandate to build a lot more housing.
Yeah.
You've read the book. Who's to blame and what's the solution, I guess, to this sort of this regulatory thing that's pushing down on and then pushing up costs?
Well, there's a lot to blame, and a lot of it goes back to some of the legal implications of things that were created to help make clean air and clean water. And they're being deployed in ways that don't actually serve that purpose anymore, so it's being usurped, where folks who would call traditionally NIMBYs, not in my backyard, have cited these laws that were meant to protect things on purpose. So that's one. And also the layers, all the layers sound great, right? Like I think in Abundance, he gave an example of a housing project in Los Angeles or San Francisco, and it had all these requirements, project labor agreements, which are great, equity components, which are great, energy components, which are great, like all these layers.
And one of them was, I think it was Los Angeles. There was also, because it was near a freeway, they wanted to have higher end air filtration systems because they didn't want people breathing the fumes from the exhaust pipes. But that added a lot of money.
And a lot of that is necessary, is not necessary, right? So I think part of it is there's certainly this need to layer on all these things to solve social ills in a way that it doesn't actually work. So if your goal is to build more housing, right? That's the key. So I have a proposal that I'm shopping with the governor's policy team right now. It's not public yet because I haven't vetted it with them. I call it Fast Track WA, where we effectively use the abundance mindset, have a few pilot programs in key areas where we know that they're rent overburdened, where we're likely to have less regulatory pushback, where some of the regulations that we have in place, if they were removed, wouldn't cause harm, and just prove to people that we can build this and build it faster. So my proposal is to implement something like that, show that there's a model that exists, and then try to replicate it across various jurisdictions.
Because I think the taxpayers are going to be looking at this additional money going into the Housing Trust Fund and saying, okay, great, more money to build affordable housing. But as you said, historically, it's only accounted for 2% of what's needed, right? How do you get that percentage up? Now, it's not going to be the whole solution, because as you noted, the private capital and private markets are needed. But can't we make those dollars go further?
We can. We can make it go further by reducing some of that regulatory burden. There's a report that's being done by the Association of Washington Businesses. It's modeled after Colorado, where they've actually done a study and said using public dollars adds about 22% to a housing project because you have to comply with all of these things. So there are certainly ways for us to be more efficient. The other part, too, is that if you look at our regulatory burdens, a lot of it is on accident. So one thing that I'm dealing with right now is that we have two major pieces, or one major, one kind of minor housing policies in Washington State, the 1110, the Middle Housing Bill, and 1337, which is the ADU bill. Our team was trying to implement that for comp plans. We're going back with cities right now. The definition of density is different in one as it is in other. So there's a lot of confusion and ambiguity. One defines it by the number of units on that lot by square footage, and then one defines it by ADUs don't count as a unit. So which one do we use? So cities want to use one, we want to use others. So there's a lot of harmonization that can be done. Part of that pilot program is we need to layer on all the regulations associated with building in a specific area, use whether it's AI or just our own internal teams to help figure out where we can harmonize, and then actually fix that. So we can move forward as well. And there's going to be some aggressive things that I'll suggest that we might do as Washington State, but I can't. Yeah. I'm not in charge.
Right.
So.
but you do this idea of at least on a pilot basis trying to fast track. We've seen that done in cities like San Francisco. Yeah. See if in some communities it could work and see what the results are, and then report back as your vision.
Yeah, because success begets success. A lot of times in government, you just study things and study things and study things, or you give it to middle management and they just study it and then study it and study it, and then it dies. So my whole point is that we have to go against that inertia. And one of the ways that you do it from a leadership model is called small wins. You show success, and it wins, and you win, and you win, and you get another one. So my whole point is that we want to prove that we can build things effectively as progressives.
I can imagine that some in the housing sector, housing business industry would say, you're part of the problem because when you were in the legislature, you were helping to pass laws that put more restrictions, trying to phase out natural gas, higher energy efficiency requirements, having to put in more expensive heating system, on and on and on. Yeah. You're just layering on. And now you're in this role saying we got to figure out a way to reduce costs and blaze through the bureaucracy. You can't have it both ways.
Well, you can, because you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, especially in the housing side, right? Most of the emissions that come in Washington State, there's about 200 covered entities that produce about 85% of the emissions in Washington State. So you can decarbonize those particular industries and capture most of the carbon. And then the housing stock, it can be handled in a different way as well. So I think that there are ways to do both in a very unique case. But in this case, if our goal is to build housing, let's build more housing.
Let's talk about agriculture. Huge, again, going back to sort of trade and trade dependency, and a huge part of our economy. We have a graphic about that as well. Washington State is a leader in agricultural production and exports. We rank number 1 in the nation for apples, cherries, blueberries, and pears, number 2 for apricots, asparagus, grapes, and potatoes. Frozen potatoes, which a lot of people might associate with Idaho, we actually do $1 billion plus a year. And you told me a few minutes ago before we started this that we export a lot to Canada.
Yeah.
90% of our wheat is exported, 33% of our apples, 25% of our cherries. Tariffs here in Washington in terms of potential impacts could be about $7.5 billion on state agricultural exports. So let's start with the tariffs first and the impacts potentially to especially our ag sector. You've got those farmers growing stuff in eastern Washington. It's being trucked to the ports in Seattle, Tacoma. It's being shipped to countries
Largely
across
Asia.
the ocean. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a huge part of our economy.
It is a huge part of our
and
economy.
I often say that the farmers in central and eastern Washington are the most international people you'll meet in this state. They are traveling constantly to these trading partner countries. They have relationships they've built over decades.
Yeah, and I've gone with them. I was in Vietnam about a year ago, almost a year ago to date actually, with producers of cherries and wheat and apple opening up markets in Vietnam. One of the stops that we made to us would have meant nothing, but it functionally was a mini Costco, right? Like it's just a grocery store that was, probably in the same level as a Walmart is probably what I would say. And they were so proud of it because they had a whole section on Washington goods. The fact that the Vietnamese community has a middle class that can afford Washington goods, they were proud of it. They had our seafood. And now we're seeing that all being disrupted and devastated. And again, like I said, this happened last time in 2020.
I'm glad you brought the aquaculture up too, because that's another
it's
a big export.
very,
market.
very big. So this is something that I'm very concerned about is because this happened last time and we're still not recovered from that. And these tariffs are even worse than that as well. And you'll hear this a lot in the agricultural communities that you're price takers, not price makers. So it isn't as if you can just raise your prices on potatoes and cover the cost of the tariffs. They oftentimes have to eat that cost because you can't make the market in the agricultural sector because you're competing against the world. So this is going to have a really bad impact for our communities.
What kinds of conversations are happening? I know at the beginning we talked a little bit about what can and cannot be mitigated, but what is the action plan at this point, especially as it relates to agriculture?
Yeah, the sad part is, the United States historically has had trade policies that would ensure that we built more allies. A lot of these imbalances that are being used to justify these tariffs are because we have imbalances. Well, after the war, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, we had the Marshall Plan, we had all these plans where our whole point was we turned adversaries into allies, and it made our economies better. Their economy growing made our economy grow. So one of the biggest things that we could do now is find other opportunities to diversify some of the products that we have from our agricultural community. Like you said, it takes a long, long time. Finding ways to help mitigate costs in other places, finding ways to help them just, weather the storm a little bit as well. But again, as much as we can do in Washington State, we don't have the same impact that we can have, with the global economy.
A couple data points here. I want to mention that apples, cherries, potatoes, wheat, hops, and dairy are all subject to retaliatory tariffs, according to the governor's office. India has imposed a 20% retaliatory tariff on U.S. apples, causing our shipments to fall by almost 100%, it looks like. I mean, dramatic drop. And at the same time, the state's agricultural exports, even without tariffs, were already facing uncertainty due to rising costs of production, imported farm supplies, rising fuel costs, so on and so forth. So you've got a lot of kind of commingling pressure points or headwinds.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing for us is keep in touch with our agricultural communities. I was on a call with folks in Patty Murray in the agriculture community as well. And I think the biggest thing is, have our federal delegations push back, make sure that the administration understands that, candidly, these are his supporters that he's hurting the most. And then also diversifying our partners as well, finding other opportunities for them to be able to sell.
Just briefly, on the aerospace and tech sector piece, anything in particular that you've heard comes to mind as a particular concern, again, in terms of this current climate we're in?
Oh, if you look at the steel or you look at just the critical minerals that we need for, say, for instance, our airplanes, that'll be impacted. Boeing, I think, will be one of the largest in terms of their exposure to retaliatory tariffs. On the tech sector specifically, there's a whole host of things, chips and manufacturing associated with that is going to be impacted. And then what people don't realize is that we actually export a lot of services, especially to India. So how does that work for us in Washington State, where we rely on services and not just physical goods?
Okay, let's talk a little bit, step back, and we'll kind of go through several topics sort of in our rapid fire lightning round section here. You have been in your new position for, I think, coming up on 100 days. You had an ambitious 100-day plan. What did you learn? What were you able to accomplish? What remains undone?
You know what's funny? I think, so first off, any functioning organization with a new leader should have a 100-day plan. That's just like a normal thing. Mm-hmm. I think if I had sent an email and asked everybody to read it, nobody would have read it. It would have been just another thing collecting on the shelf. But because it was leaked online, it became kind of this living document in itself, which is fascinating in its own. But it was good. A lot of that was informed based off of conversations that I had with stakeholders, with staff, with issues that we found. And candidly, like I said, this is probably the third time I've done this type of change management, not at this scale, but there's a lot of things that are very similar. And one of the biggest things that I've learned in the past is that you can only move as fast as the culture allows. And there are certain ways for us to make that much more palatable. So for instance, one of the things that I learned is there's about 20% of people who are ready to go. They're in it, they get that we need change, we have to do something. I would say 70% of people are more of a, I'm just here doing my job, things are fine, things are not fine, but I'm not gonna try to rock the boat. And then a small percentage of folks who are gonna be very upset no matter what, they just don't wanna change. And you can kind of call out some of the folks in abundance, the folks that the abundance Ezra Klein calls out, that's probably that group. So what I've done is focus on, how do we empower those leaders who want to change, and how do we get the folks on the fence to move forward? And then for the folks who don't want to move forward, they can figure out how they want to handle that as well. The funny part is that it's actually hard to find those folks who want change because they've been beaten down for so long. So for me, a lot of it is holding myself accountable. I have what's called a director's corner at Commerce. I answer every single question that people give to me. We had weekly all hands with our entire organization. We had very transparent, blunt conversations about budget deficits and kind of how we want to mitigate them as well. And then I've basically told my assistant directors, all of our leaders, that this is the new vision. We need to feed into this vision. This is something that the governor wants us to do. So setting that tone is important.
You said you want to change the ethos.
That's right.
Of the agency.
Yeah.
And do you think at 100 days in?
Yes.
You've started to do
that? Like a weekend. Mm-hmm. I mean, so I spend half my time in Olympia and half my time in Seattle. The first week I came in there, I had staff members come in and say, I've never seen a director before. Last Friday, I went out with my technology team. They're great individuals, fantastic. They were not excited about some of the technology changes that I want to do at first. And we actually went to a hackathon in Seattle it's called the AI House that the Commerce helped fund. And they, as technologists, were playing with the latest and greatest tools, and they were so excited. They changed. So them seeing somebody who actually cares about them and their work, having a vision for how we want to move forward, addressing some of these concerns. Like I said before, demos over memos. So a lot of it is that when you have people historically who maybe hadn't been as engaged as they could be, now you have somebody who built a demo with the technology team. You had somebody who worked with the community services division to help with grantees. That certainly changed.
What are some of the tech changes you want to see?
Nothing that sexy, to be honest with you. So right now, the hardest part that I think, there's a story today in the Seattle Times about data modernization.
Yeah, and how much it's costing.
And how much it's costing and how long it takes.
To try to update these systems, yeah.
We're not inventing anything new. All of these things are publicly available and oftentimes commercially available off of the shelf. So centralizing our data, using services that are now available to us, being able to, so right now, I cannot do this in Commerce right now. If I wanted to see a grantee and all of the grants associated with them, not possible.
There's not a dashboard that just shows you that.
Yeah, so being able to combine and standardize data sets, being able to do it safely, being able to do it in the cloud, being able to build tools on top will transform how we operate. Like I said, I built an AI chatbot over the weekend, and my tech team is doing one that's more robust, that's also compliant with every rules and regulations. It's things like that.
What is the opportunity you see in state government for AI?
I think it's huge. I think it's absolutely huge when it comes to regulatory and compliance. Just the fact that you can ingest the state auditing and accounting manual, 1,067 pages, and then have confidence in how you're talking to it in plain language, I think is huge. I think for us to use that to make permitting, citing faster as well, I think for us to enable and unlock the expertise and skill. So a lot of the employees at Commerce are fantastic individuals. They're subject matter experts in their space, oftentimes have advanced degrees, and most of them, we're asking them to basically check invoices and receipts. We're asking them to review documents of legalese, to work with our grantees. Imagine if they're spending all of their time on developing the best program that they know how. They're working with the grantees to better understand the grantees. They're working to make sure that the outcomes are aligned with what the intent is. So if we can shift from basically being a reactive defensive organization to a proactive organization, it'd be transformative. So one of the things that we launched last week, in my 100-day plan, I talked about doing an NSAT, so basically a customer satisfaction survey. We launched it last Thursday. Within 1 day, we had over 1,000 respondents. We have 1,336 when I left the building just now to come here, with feedback from communities across Washington State to tell us how to get better. So even collecting that feedback, I'm going to put onto a dashboard so you can see it. I don't think people are going to go to the dashboard, but that's a way to hold myself accountable, to hold Commerce accountable as well.
What is your view of allowing state employees to continue to work from home?
I think as long as the outcomes are what we want them to be, they shouldn't matter where they work, right? Obviously, we have rules and regulations, and they should be in Washington State because of all these compliance rules. But for me, one of my first bills, as you may remember, was the 4-day work week. I knew that it wasn't going to pass.
Still waiting around for that one.
You and me both. In fact, I actually think we have it now in a pseudo way. Meaning that with flexibility in your schedule, you can structure your day in a way where you have that autonomy, where you can be more thoughtful about how you spend your time and energy.
But I know governors, Governor Newsom brought people, is ordering people back. And
Yeah,
you're
there's
not the
certainly
governor, you're
benefits.
an agency head, but there seems to be different thinking about whether, especially for government employees, whether a
Yeah.
fully remote model is working. We've seen companies like Amazon bring
Yeah.
people back.
Yeah, and there's certainly an implication on the culture associated with it. And I think I would personally favor a hybrid model, but I think we're very lucky to have quality, talented individuals, especially at Commerce, where as long as the work gets done and the outcome is there, But what I'll say is, you'd be shocked at how much people actually do want to come back. So I come into the office in Olympia and I come to the office in Seattle. We just did a survey for our Olympia office because right now largely it's empty, but it's empty because people don't really have defined spaces. 30% of the respondents wanted to be in the office. So we actually have a strong appetite for folks who want to work in person, but we want to have the flexibility as well.
I want to end on this stat. Washington State has a dozen billionaires. We would have had 13, but Jeff Bezos moved
just
to
sold
Florida.
his house for
So
6
you're the commerce director. Your job is to attract businesses to the state.
Yeah.
Maybe attract billionaires. Where are you going to go find the 13th to replace Jeff Bezos? What is your plan to bring in that next big opportunity for Washington, or maybe medium or small opportunity?
We have
Or
a
billionaire.
lot of tremendous assets in Washington State that people care about. And in fact, I met with an energy company that, should they be successful, I think they could get to that level of status. And the funny part was, they kind of started off the conversation with, if only you made our taxes lower, our B&O lower. And my point being,
Well,
to
and
him-
there's criticism from Republicans and business people right now that the Democrats in the legislature are about to make this a much less friendly place to do business.
And the pushback that I had to him was, in venture capital, there's a concept called the valley of death, right? So yes, you could lower their taxes, but they have to get a commercially viable product first. And the ways that you do that is having like a regulatory regime, a workforce, energy infrastructure, things that can help them be successful. Do I think Washington State should be the bottom feeder? Would they always be the lowest when it comes to cost? The answer is probably no, because we have a quality of life and workforce that is commensurate with that value. So I think we can do things like provide more housing, provide energy, provide a clean air, clean economy that people want to come. And because of that, they'll be able to build their businesses as well. So there's a lot of businesses in California that are very successful with a lot of billionaires. Their regulations are worse than ours. So there are certainly things that we can do to help.
Do you think the capital gains tax chased Jeff Bezos out of our state?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know him personally, nor do I know his financial advisor, so I can't comment on that. I do think that having access to early education and resources for our schools will set us up in the long term.
Okay. We'll stop there. Commerce Director Nguyen, almost 100 days into the new job,
Yeah.
and obviously we had a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
And we'll do it
do more.
again. Thanks
you
for your time.
I appreciate it.
And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.